Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Pink Floyd Roger Waters record, The Dark Side of the Moon Redux. Why? Who asked for this? Look, before I start this review, I just want to clarify, I do not hate Pink Floyd. Look. That's the wall on vinyl right there, okay? I bought that with my hard-earned money, and by that I mean I stole it from my dad's record collection. But it's a good album. I like Pink Floyd. I'm not a Floyd hater, okay? Now that we've gotten that out of the way, on with the review. None of you can comment that I just don't like Pink Floyd now, alright? In the best possible scenario, re-recording an album can result in something absolutely beautiful and something that improves the legacy of an artist or band, and in the worst case scenario, it can give birth to an absolute monstrosity that is just a scourge on someone's legacy. Seeing an artist rework a piece of music from their younger years to fit how they are in the modern day artistically can be downright explosive in the best possible outcomes that have come out over time. You know, old sounds dragged into modernity. You can have outdated ideas, concepts freshened up. It can really be a beautiful thing when done right. That being said, most of the major examples of albums being re-recorded over the years primarily come from two particular reasons. One, legal reasons, see, say, Taylor Swift's Taylor's Version series, or two, the fulfillment of an artistic vision that was not totally completed upon the initial release of the record. See the 2018 version of Car Seat Headrest's Twin Fantasy compared to the original 2011 version. That being said, one thing that is very uncommon, and really odd actually, is when an artist takes an album that most people consider to be pretty damn perfect, as well as one of their best works, and re-records it half a century after it first released. It just so happens that it's even more rare for said album to be one of the most enduring pieces of media throughout the entirety of the 20th century, and the only thing more rare than that is finding who asked Roger Waters to just butcher The Dark Side of the Moon in 2023. Who wanted this? It's difficult to discern what Waters was really going for when he made this. I mean, like I said, most of the time when albums are re-recorded, there's a legitimate purpose to them, and at that, a believable purpose, but I'll get into that in a little bit. You know, Tangerine Dream's Phaedra 2005 was the recreation of a classic electronic record with dated sounds that record pulled into modern styles of electronic music. Brian Wilson's Smile was, again, the fulfillment of a creative vision that was once lost to a long unreleased record, etc., etc. There are plenty of examples of artists taking an album and redoing it for a real reason. The Dark Side of the Moon Redux does not root itself in reason. Waters himself has stated that the intent of the Dark Side of the Moon Redux is to have all of the record's perspective be redone from the perspective of an 80-year-old man. And hey, you know what? That's fair. Roger Waters was 80 when this record came out, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with approaching an album that has heavy amounts of existentialism within it from a new set of eyes, for lack of better term, and ultimately, I don't think that there's a problem with the concept of this record. The problem comes in with how little is done with that idea. I mean, when this record originally came out, he was a 30-year-old only a few years away from a midlife crisis. Now he's an 80-year-old man, and, well, I don't know if you'll believe me when I say this, but those points in your life are very different, I imagine. So it only makes sense that this record would come across as something totally different from what it did originally via a re-recording, except the only issue is that it doesn't. Not because it isn't able to, but because Waters chooses not to make it different. Much of the album's lyrical content remains the exact same and doesn't feel that different from the original record here nor there in terms of tone or delivery, except that it's backed by weaker instrumentals, weaker vocal work, etc., etc. And the original lyricism from this record is pretty great, and I would have no problem with it being retained for the sake of this album if it weren't for the fact that this is supposed to be from a new perspective, except Waters is spouting the exact same concepts and ideas from the original Dark Side of the Moon. It's the same exact lyrics, it's the same exact delivery of those lyrics, it's the same exact ideas and concepts from the original record, and there's no problem with that, But the intent of this album is for that to not happen, for this to not be a retread of the original album, to pass that concept over for the sake of being something entirely different, this sort of late stage statement of Waters' life. And it's not. It's just a recreation, word for word, damn near, of the original Dark Side of the Moon album. I mean, honestly, it really does make one wonder how much truth there was in Waters' sentiment of wanting to add new perspective to Dark Side of the Moon. I'm not gonna lie, it's not shocking that a Pink Floyd member has done something weird or strange or shady or shitty over time. That's not something that's been uncommon to this band's history. But at the same time, you would expect at least some level of commitment to the ideas that he explicitly stated in interviews. The commentary on consumerism is the exact same in the now god-awful Money, and Breathe's existentialist devotion to appreciating life is the exact same here as it was on the original record. Nothing has changed, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in theory, but when so many other qualities of this record are produced with a huge amount of weakness, and nothing is being changed, despite the fact that this record is, again, meant to be some sort of grand statement that differs from the original release, it definitely is rough to hear word-for-word recreations of a lot of the original record's lyrics. Meanwhile, there's also the occasional usage of other ideas and themes from other Pink Floyd records on here, and that's just about as bad. This is especially shown in Speak to Me, the album opening track that was the exact same on the original record, albeit in a completely sound collage-esque kind of style. On the original Dark Side, it made for a surreal psychedelic opening that ultimately opens the doors to this very lush, vast atmosphere that the rest of the tracklist delivers up to that point. And just like every other song on this record, it is absolutely brutalized on this redo. The aforementioned song in its present form is just devoid of any emotion or emotional buildup of any kind. It doesn't act as a proper intro to the record by any means, and ultimately a lot of the power and striking qualities that were in the original is replaced by Waters doing a spoken word reading of the track Free 4, a Pink Floyd deep cut from their 1972 record Obscured by Clouds. And while I do think that record is underrated, and I do think that the original Free 4 is a good track, it just does not make sense here, especially when you're taking away some of the defining qualities of Speak to Me, one of the most definitive album opening songs throughout the history of psychedelic and progressive music. I digress. It's still a moment where Waters is doing something different, which also means it's about the only moment on the entire record where it feels like Waters is doing something that warrants him doing a re-recording of Dark Side of the Moon, kind of ish, and the execution is so horrible and laughable that it doesn't even manage to stand on its own as a single shining moment on this record. It falls just as flat as the rest of it. It almost feels like Waters is sort of going for a dark career-ending album, just like a final big statement to go out on. Not that I'm like predicting the dude's death or anything. I promise I'm not wishing death upon Roger Waters. But at the same time, the darkness and the moodiness of this and the sort of ambient-esque influences found throughout a lot of it, it feels like he's going for a sort of David Bowie, Black Star, Leonard Cohen, You Want It Darker kind of vibe, and it just does not work. Whereas those aforementioned records were extremely experimental pieces from extremely talented artists who really wanted to go out with these dark but still powerful bangs that really defined the last moments of their careers, the rehashed qualities throughout the entirety of the Dark Side of the Moon Redux just come across as wildly inessential, and it makes me wonder, why would you listen to this when you have the original Dark Side of the Moon? It's completely unnecessary. While a lack of proper creative direction and purpose probably doomed this album from the start, I will also say that Waters' vocal work does not help at all. It's pretty awful throughout this. The Dark Side of the Moon is just a demonstration of vocal prowess, more specifically the lack thereof. I mean, the original Dark Side of the Moon didn't have Nina Simone belting out tunes in this super powerful way or anything, but a lot of these subtle melodies and vocal harmonies define some of the most beautiful moments throughout the original record. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the most iconic moments on that album have to do with the way that certain lyrics are delivered overall. And here, Waters' reimagining of Dark Side of the Moon fumbles the ball with that quality as well. The worst offender by far is the previously mentioned redone version of Money, which is practically wheezed out by Roger Waters over this semi dark, moody jazz instrumental that doesn't really know what it wants to be in terms of style or tone. And it's by far one of, if not the worst song I've heard all year. There's bound to be cries that it's not a fair criticism to talk about Roger Waters singing. Oh, he's 80 years old. His vocals on Money are fine for an 80-year-old. Yeah, sure, maybe, except for the fact that if you listen to the entire album, he doesn't sing like that on every single track. He specifically chooses to just grind those vocals out on Money specifically. It's a creative choice, and again, it results in one of the worst songs, if not the worst song, I've heard throughout the entire year. Do you know how much competition there was this year for that so far? There was a 36 song long Morgan Wallen album, and I genuinely think that Roger Waters' redone version of Money might beat all 36 of those songs. That's an achievement. I kinda commend the man for it. Elsewhere, Waters just seems almost comically uninterested in what he's singing, specifically during the portions that were lyrics from the original record. I mean, how he can take a spine-chilling phrase or lyric, specifically in Brain Damage, for example, the lunatic is in the hall part, you know, the really iconic part, one of the most popular passages in the entire discography of Pink Floyd, how he manages to make such a spine-tingling moment feels so limp, feels so weak, feels so fragile. It is beyond me. It is baffling. I guess you could say there's a sort of attempt at tenderness throughout songs like Time, but I don't know, man. It just comes across as a washed up jam band going through the motions doing a Pink Floyd tribute at the exact same time. It's rough. Waters himself, obviously, isn't the only person that's sort of a criminal for the butchering of this classic album. I mean, the entire band just sounds passionless. Extremely, extremely passionless. The instrumental mission statement of the Dark Side of the Moon Redux, at least according to Roger Waters, who, as I've established up to this point, isn't really the most trustworthy source, but I digress, was to really accentuate the emotional moments on the album. And the first time I read that, I thought, hey, that's great. It's an emotional album already, so really pushing that concept of just grand emotion, I love to hear it, love to see it. We love to see it, Roger. And then I listened to this album, and as he's done things like remove certain passages, particularly guitar solos, and replaced them with his own spoken word prose, which is not only lesser than compared to the actual lyrics from the original album, as well as shoehorned in and awkwardly produced in a wildly compressed way, it just doesn't make sense. That isn't to mention that those that are familiar with the original album, which is pretty much every person that's been alive since the early 70s, it's going to feel awkward hearing these songs with mediocre, semi-freeform poetry, and as a whole, it just, again, does not work at all. It feels ridiculously forced. I mean, the drums just kind of feel weak and milquetoast in delivery. Jonathan Wilson's guitar work may as well just not even exist whatsoever. And any of the emotional grandiosity that was so successful in the original Dark Side of the Moon is completely thrown out the window for nuance lacking self-obsession in this comically vain attempt to produce something of note in a faux spiritual sort of manner. I think the best example of this may actually come from the track Any Color You Like, one of the lesser discussed songs from the original, and it only makes sense. The original album has it as a lovely instrumental. It practically plays as just an interlude between much more noteworthy songs, but nonetheless, it's still a great track overall. And here, it's not an instrumental, because Roger Waters doesn't know how to shut up. I specifically think that I can kind of make my point by just repeating the opening verse from Any Color You Like on this record specifically, which is, it's hard to understand, bombarded as we are by hot words, like molecules in an electron microscope battered from pillar to post. As intellectual as that sounds, it's not Waters saying anything. It's just faux intellectualism to disguise the fact that nothing is being added by him here. He's just rehashing a classic record from his old band, while adding in some middling at best spoken word portions that don't fit the album at all and don't add anything to any of the concepts or overarching themes found throughout this record. And I mean it too. I really think that in that verse alone, as well as a variety of the other spoken word verses and passages throughout this record, there's this sort of, again, faux intellectualism that's made to act as a facade to help you ignore the fact that this was most likely made just to cash in on the 50th anniversary of one of the most beloved albums of all time. That sums up the record pretty well. And you know what? The quality of the album's corresponding with that. Look, I'll be the first to admit, The Dark Side of the Moon, the original version, is far from being my favorite Pink Floyd album, and for as iconic as that record is, it's certainly not a hot take to say so or anything, but at the same time, even if it's not my favorite album in the world, it's also a virtually perfect album, and I genuinely think that you would be hard-pressed to find even a handful of the biggest music dorks on this planet who would actually change something about that album, whether they like it or not. There's just nothing about the original that needs altering. It just so happens that one of the few people on this planet that, for some godforsaken reason, think that Dark Side of the Moon needs some sort of massive overhaul is one of the dudes that was behind Dark Side of the Moon. It's a tragedy because it resulted in this. Sure, there have been plenty of times where Roger Waters has seemingly implied or stated some sort of intent or purpose behind the Dark Side of the Moon Redux. And hey, an anniversary, no matter how old a record is always a fairly valid reason to re-record an album if you genuinely want to. There's been some pretty recent examples of that. See Thrice and their 20th anniversary re-recording of The Artist in the Ambulance, for example. Completely different style of music, but nonetheless, you get my point. It's possible for a record like Dark Side of the Moon Redux to actually be good. What is necessary for an album like this, or any album even within the re-recording, re-releasing ballpark to succeed, is that it needs to have desire behind it. Desire for an album that's being re-recorded to just be better than the original in some way. And not only would it really probably not be possible to be better than the original Dark Side of the Moon, but there's just no desire here. There's no want from Roger Waters or anyone else in making this album that wants it to be better. It does not try to be any sort of unique add-on to Dark Side of the Moon. It doesn't try to usurp the original from its throne. It doesn't try to do anything. It just kind of exists as an album that rehashes the original record's concepts, ideas, and even lyrics, and just throws a few different things in there that are slightly different while giving wildly minimalistic and extremely lazy instrumentals. Roger Waters solely made this for the purpose of pandering towards the types of people that still continue to circle jerk about the greatness of Dark Side of the Moon and Pink Floyd as a band, and while I can kind of respect that from a business perspective, it also does result in what is easily one of the sloppiest, laziest, and most passionless albums I've heard all year, and in quite a few years, actually. What I'm trying to say is, man, I cannot wait for Rolling Stone to call this a masterpiece. I'm going to give this record half a star out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I have been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.